The children adored him. He didn't care for them. His thoughts were elsewhere. Nothing that these urchins could do ever tried his patience. Cold, just, impassive, and at the same time loved because his coming had in a measure banished dullness from the house, he was a good tutor. For his part, he felt only hatred and horror for the high society in which he was allowed to occupy the very foot of the table, a position which may perhaps explain his hatred and horror. There were certain formal dinners at which he could barely contain his loathing of everything round about him. On St. Louis's Day, in particular, Monsieur Valenod was laying down the law at Monsieur de Rênal's. Julien almost gave himself away. He escaped into the garden, saying that he must look after the children. "What panegyrics of honesty!" he exclaimed. "Anyone would say that was the one and only virtue. And yet what consideration! What a cringing respect for a man who obviously has doubled and tripled his fortune since he has been in charge of the relief of the poor. I would wager that he makes something even out of the funds set apart for the foundlings, those wretches whose need is even more sacred than that of the other paupers. Ah, monsters, monsters! And I, too, I am a sort of foundling, hated by my father, my brothers, my whole family." Some days earlier, Julien, walking by himself and saying his office in the little wood known as the Belvedere, which overlooks the Cour de la Fidélité, had tried in vain to avoid his two brothers whom he saw approaching him by a solitary path. The jealousy of these rough labourers had been so quickened by the sight of their brother's handsome black coat and air of extreme gentility, as well as by the sincere contempt which he felt for them, that they had proceeded to thrash him, leaving him there unconscious and bleeding freely. Madame de Rênal, who was out walking with Monsieur Valenod and the sub-prefect, happened to turn into the little wood. She saw Julien lying on the ground and thought him dead. She was so overcome as to make Monsieur Valenod jealous. His alarm was premature. Julien admired Madame de Rênal's looks, but hated her for her beauty. It was the first reef on which his fortune had nearly foundered. He spoke to her as seldom as possible, in the hope of making her forget the impulse which, at their first encounter, had led him to kiss her hand. Elisa, Madame de Rênal's maid, hadn't failed to fall in love with the young tutor. She often spoke of him to her mistress. Miss Elisa's love had brought upon Julien the hatred of one of the footmen. One day he heard this man say to Elisa, "You won't speak to me any more since that greasy tutor has been in the house." Julien didn't deserve the epithet, but with the instinct of a good-looking youth became doubly attentive to his person. Monsieur Valenod's hatred was multiplied accordingly. He said in public that such effeminate ways were not becoming in a young cleric. Barring the cassock, Julien now wore clerical attire. Madame de Rênal observed that he was speaking more often than before to Miss Elisa. She learned that these conversations were due to the limitations of Julien's extremely small wardrobe. He had so scanty a supply of linen that he was obliged to send it out constantly to be washed, and it was in performing these little services that Elisa made herself useful to him. This extreme poverty, of which she had had no suspicion, touched Madame de Rênal. She longed to make him presents, but didn't dare. This inward resistance was the first feeling of regret that Julien caused her. Until then, the name of Julien and the sense of a pure and wholly intellectual joy had been synonymous to her. Tormented by the idea of Julien's poverty, Madame de Rênal spoke to her husband about making him a present of linen. "What idiocy!" he replied. "What? Make presents to a man with whom we are perfectly satisfied and who is serving us well? It is when he neglects his duty that we should stimulate his zeal." Madame de Rênal felt ashamed of this way of looking at things. Before Julien came, she wouldn't have noticed it. She never saw the young cleric's spotless, though very simple toilet, without asking herself, "Poor boy, how ever does he manage?" As time went on, She began to feel sorry for Julien's deficiencies instead of being shocked by them.